So I am really gassed to be interviewing Natalie Wynn, aka ContraPoints, who is what the kids call a big fucking deal on YouTube, debunking some core myths of the alt-right with a level of depth and nuance and humour that I just find ridiculously impressive. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
So my first question is just to sort of jump head first into the area of political intervention that you find yourself in, which is this idea of the dark enlightenment. So you've got figures like Jordan Peterson, whose sort of natural skepticism in some ways contrasts with the Judeo-Christian crusade of Ben Shapiro, and then the sort of strange, callow, ultra shit posting brands of Count Dankula or Sargon of Akkad. But yeah, I wanted to ask you about this so-called dark enlightenment and what is its ultimate political vision, because that's the bit which people seem to get a bit confused about. Is it fascism? Is it a new brand of conservatism? Is it classical liberalism?
I don't think so. Some leftists will tell you that the dark enlightenment is fascism or crypto fascism. I think that's going much too far. I think that is there a real issue with fascism online? Yes, but Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson are not it. What Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson are is actually something really, really boring, which is conservatives. And I think that the dark enlightenment language that they're using, like it's a lot of work that's being done to create a kind of mystique around something that's very old and very boring. And I think that, if you look at the things that they're saying, they basically, like, they framed themselves as this like renegade underground dark, like, group of intellectuals who are struggling to be heard in this world where they're being brutally oppressed and silenced. But the thing is, like, we're hearing from them constantly. I can't go a day without listening to these assholes. Like, I so it's like, what is dark about this? Like, these people have a position. These people go on tours and speak at universities. Like, it's really a kind of theatrics. Really, this presentation of themselves as being somehow censored. I mean, as far as their political viewpoint, well, okay, so I say they're not fascists, but are they regressive? Well, yes. I mean, if you want to talk about like politics around the sort of social justice issues, for example, activism about feminism or around racial equality or transgender issues or whatever it is. I mean, there's if you're against that kind of thing, there's kind of two ways you can do it. One is to be, an overt racist, or sort of sexist, but this is not a very popular option because it's just not a lot of room for that in the discourse. So what you do instead is you argue that, oh, the proponents of these things have gone too far. They're coming for your freedom. They're going to destroy the family, whatever it is, right? And that is basically what people like Shapiro or people like Peterson are doing, which is just like an old school conservative move. It's not even rhetorically innovative. It's just the same thing again. And I sort of at this point, struggle like to make these people interesting. I think that unfortunately the moment has kind of passed when uh, you know, Paul Joseph Watson of InfoWars could tweet conservatism is the new punk rock and have that whole like, really fly with anyone. Because I think at this point it's everyone's kind of the sense I get anyway is that this moment of coolness that this had, when Milo Yiannopoulos was going on tour in 2016, or in like, as far as I see it, this is done. Like, it's not that cool anymore. But they certainly had their little moment, which I view as really fundamentally a backlash against gains made or gains about to be made in social activism.
I mean, I think one of the things which maybe is new is the role of humour, and not humour like, ha ha ha, I find this genuinely funny and I'm laughing from my belly. It's the sort of evasive cloak of layers of irony and references where, unless you're steeped in those online subcultures and you try to engage with it in a sincere way, you will be laughed off as someone who simply doesn't get it.
Yeah, so I think that I mean, this is being new kind of rhetoric, right? Memes, jokes, irony, this kind of super referential way of talking about politics. On the one hand, this is just the way people talk on the internet. And so it's just politics being expressed in the language of the internet. On the other hand, I do think that there is a kind of particular way that far right extremist ideas found a couple of years ago that they could particularly use, kind of conventions of internet humor as a sort of cloak for the extent of their extremism, right? So this like idea of like edginess as a way of basically, um, it's a camouflage for sincere fascism. That was something that I really was very frustrated trying to observe in 2017 when no one was listening, and no one would take seriously the notion that there were these people on 4chan who actually wanted a white ethno state. And there's since been several terrorist attacks inspired by it. So I have an easier time these days, I find, persuading people to take it seriously. But I wish I hadn't taken that.
I found your work a kind of interesting subversion of some of the tools that they use, at least aesthetically, which is sort of like the quick cuts, the use of humor, the layering of jokes. There are these references peppered throughout your videos, which are sort of sly nods to sort of previous takedowns you've done of reactionary ideologies. So one being like, what's up, adult human females, as a kind of, jab at like TERF ideology. So thinking about just like purely the aesthetics of forming online political communities, do you find like in a weird way that they've understood the most democratic form of communication that's ever existed better than the left?
Yeah, I do think so. I think that a lot of the people who have attempted to use the internet as a medium for like leftist propaganda, or not even propaganda, like, just to spread leftist ideas or progressive ideas, have tended to use YouTube as basically like a substitute for a classroom, as in they basically approach a topic, aesthetically or stylistically, as you would approach the topic at a university speaking event, right? So a lot of these, videos would be like, the way of speaking and the way of presenting, the way you would do it there. Whereas people on the right, especially in this kind of far right YouTube politics that sort of became a whole ecosystem during Gamergate, where you had these like far right like gaming channels basically, and then like political channels emerge around them. It was the language of YouTube, but they were talking about politics. And whereas with leftist content, it was the language of academia, but on YouTube. So I think that what have tried to do since the beginning is, in a sense, do what those right-wing channels were doing, which is speak in the language of YouTube, speak in the language of the internet. That's the form, that's the style, that's the aesthetic, that's where I am, and that's how I'm gonna, work. And then the content, the fact that it's about leftist content, like it's really kind of surprising to me that like not more people had done this sooner, because this is just simply the most effective way to get people to listen to you online.
I mean, it doesn't really surprise me that it's not been done sooner, because I think a lot of the time the left forgets about a sense of like fun and irreverence and style. And perhaps that's because after, decades in the electoral wilderness, where the left survived were these like really like rigid, hierarchical institutions, which didn't have much room for that kind of flair. And those spaces of experimentation and like even like libertinism to some extent, thinking here of like, the autonomous movement and their approach to making propaganda, it fizzled away. So maybe it makes sense that it took time to come back.
Well, I think that, one of the sort of the central form of leftist discourse is the critique. And the critique is a very kind of like, it's not generally a fun enterprise. Going back to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason or whatever, and up through like people like Theodore Adorno or these leftist thinkers, like these are not people who are having a lot of fun.
I mean, Kant famously was not a fun guy. He
Yeah.
was like the most regular, like there was that, I don't know if it's apocryphal, but people would set their clocks and watches by his daily walks.
Yeah. so this is the kind of personality that like sort of has sort of created the form of discourse that we now use on the left. Well, it doesn't work, so to me, one reason academic philosophy wasn't for me, in fact, I dropped out of my PhD program, was that this is not my personality. I don't want to be a critiquer. I want to be an entertainer. And uh, I think that, so what I'm doing is in a way, like, it's in a way entertainment first, which is not to say that I have no values, or not to say that I don't have these real beliefs, or that I actually do want to persuade people. But when I sit down to make a YouTube video, I have a topic in mind. Like, one of the first questions I'm going to ask is like, how can I make this entertaining to an audience? Like, it's almost like I don't imagine that I'm in a classroom. That's not the right image. I imagine more that I'm, I don't know, in a nightclub, or a, open mic night or something. People with an audience that's sitting there with the drinks in hand, expecting to be entertained. Like, that's more how I approach it than imagining that I'm a professor, like, lecturing students who are stuck being there, whether they like it or not.
I mean, I always felt that the vibe was like, imagine you were in the toilets of the Met Gala ball, and there's just someone like dressed up to the nines who's like, I'm fucking gonna tell you about, why this notion of like, our trap's gay, like a stupid framing. But I mean, let's talk about like the nuance that you create in your videos, and it's quite hard, I think, sometimes to carve out that space when there is an expectation that if you're going to do like the socially progressive take on something, you broadly know what mold it's meant to fit. So for instance, if you're answering that question of are traps gay, you're just supposed to go, this is a really harmful word for trans people, and the conversation stops there. Whereas you use that as a sort of stepping stone into a deeper discussion of gender, desire, the way in which sexuality gets taxonomized. Do you feel that the left's political culture is receptive enough of that nuance, or do you get a bit of a backlash for trying to do it?
I have gotten a backlash, especially on Twitter, where, I mean, honestly, I don't know what else to say about Twitter than like, there's a lot of people who look for things to be mad about. But I think that I just basically ignore it now. Like, this used to really deeply bother me that people people would say horrible things about me, that I was a secret fascist sympathizer, that I was doing, I had all these awful sympathies because I just don't pay attention to that anymore. And when I made the R Traps gay video, I mean, that was, to me, what that represented was a public gesture that I don't care. Because I had already been through a whole Twitter drama when I said I was going to make that video months earlier. And, a lot of people on Twitter were not having it. And so just making it anyway was like, well, I don't care. That's how I viewed that gesture. Yeah.
But I mean, like, politically, where do you think that comes from? Because the left is meant to be broadly a politics based on solidarity, mutual aid, and the collective effort of social betterment. And then you sort of see how the left has tended to use social media platforms, and you're like, that is the opposite of the political project. So where do you think that comes from?
I think part of it comes from this like good and justifiable urge to create safe spaces online for, in part, in this case, trans people, right? Trans people are used to just hostility from the world at large. So they want to create this space online where they're surrounded by people who they know they can trust, who they know won't betray them like everyone else has, who they know will always respect them, and so on. And one of the ways that you maintain a space like that is you sort of have to prove that are going to be okay with, to have to be around, by sort of being sort of meticulous about language and about this kind of thing, to constantly sort of signal that you're not one of the bad ones. Well, this doesn't really work though when you go out of that space and try to persuade anyone else. So there's this kind of it's tough, because I feel like I'm being pulled in two directions. On the one hand, like, the people who are in the online trans community, I want to do right by them, and to, I want to be someone online who's like producing content that's for them as much as anyone. But at the end of the day, like, if you're making a persuasive video essay, and the target audience is the general public, like you gotta, you have to use the word that you're talking about when you're talking about it. You have, like, you just can't start at the conclusion, um, and assume everyone knows it. You have to get there, and that involves, at least appearing to take seriously ideas that are supposed to be, too evil to discuss.
I mean, one of the things that I constantly go back and forth with myself, particularly with anti-racism, because I see that there's this disconnect between the sort of cultural strength of anti-racism in terms of the way in which anti-racist values have permeated popular culture to a far greater extent than it did like in the 1970s, and the political weakness of anti-racism. So, whether or not you identify the sort of rise of right-wing white supremacist nationalism as a sort of counter-revolution, or whether or not you think it's a longer-term political project, the anti-racist left in the UK is quite weak, and I think there are some parallels in terms of the US, where it's pop culturally very, very strong, but some of those mass mobilizations that we saw with Black Lives Matter have sort of dissipated, and where so much energy gets sucked up is this sort of analysis of everyday interpersonal minutiae. So talk a lot about microaggressions and things like that. And I understand how microaggressions are connected to a broader structure of power, but every so often I'm like, fuck me, guys, like the word micro is there for a reason. And are we, as people of colour, and I wonder if there are some parallels that you've observed when it comes to discourse around trans liberation, are we as like the more bourgeois or the more educated ones just saying, hey, why don't I get to live life like a white person with my educational background and my accent? Why can't I live like them?
Yeah, so one issue that there's always going to be in any type of social activism is that when you're dealing with the activism of a marginalized group, the most privileged people from that group are always going to have the most power, and they're going to be the loudest. And those people tend to have sort of different concerns and different frame of reference from, the least privileged people in that group. So again, right, I think some of the concern with microaggressions is that, like, when you're dealing with, like, Black students at Yale, like, that is a real problem for them. But it's like, these are among the people who represent Black Americans, like, by far the most privileged. And like the same certainly is true of feminism has always kind of had its loudest voices, or its most, coming from like Germaine Greer, or like people who really are sort of, it's educated, white, middle class, or upper class, even women who are sort of leading the charge. And in my case, like, I find that increasingly, like, I just made a video about facial feminization surgery and the politics around that. Well, if you can even afford facial feminization surgery, like, you're already in a different bracket than most of the trans community. So it's definitely an issue. And I do think that one of the effects of it is, as you say, that sometimes these issues can seem to outsiders to be more trivial than they in fact are, because the problems I face as a trans person are just not the problems that are faced by an impoverished trans woman of color in Baltimore. Like, two different worlds of difficulty. And I think the same is true with, Freddie Gray and a Black student at Yale.
I mean, I feel like now with the electoral volatility that Britain and America and lots of other countries in the global north have been experiencing, that sense of our focus can stay on the places of immense privilege is, the scales are falling away from our eyes a little bit. So in the States, you have this legal erasure of trans people, and at the same time you have this whole-scale attack on reproductive rights, in particular with regards to abortion. Now, one of the most frequent trans exclusionary radical feminist arguments is that a trans woman cannot experience the oppression on a biological basis that a cisgender woman can, like with abortion rights. Don't they have a point?
Well, yes and no. I mean, on the one hand, like, can do I am I going? Is my life ever going to be in danger because I can't get an abortion? No. Like, there's real ways in which, having my anatomy does sort of protect me from some of the effects of misogyny. So that's true. Now there is kind of a limit to that. Like, I think a lot of TERFs will their point basically is that, oh, you never experience sexism, or like you just, well, which is just not true. And so, and that when it comes to these kinds of, I've had these conversations with radical feminists where they seem to think that, oh, because because I don't have a womb, that men must take me seriously in conversation, and that I must not get talked over. And
As if they're going around with like a soft tissue scanner the whole time, like,
Yeah.
let me just, put you under this MRI before.
And yeah, exactly. It just doesn't make sense. Like, because when it comes to these like social dynamics, right, the way that men treat women on a, in the sense of every little interaction you have, right? It just, the fact that I was assigned male at birth, it's just not relevant at all. And in fact, in some ways, it can make things worse. I think most trans women have had the experience of sort of, sort of being treated like a woman while being called a man. And like, I mean, I'm thinking, like on dating sites or something. So like you'll get approached by men in like some horrible misogynistic, sexualized, aggressive way. And then when you turn them down, they call you, a delusional, man, homophobic slurs, all this kind of stuff. So they've just switched from one to the other. Like, it's not much protection from those kinds of things. So I don't know. I see this. I feel like there's room for a nuance in this conversation that I think that, sometimes trans activists don't bring when it comes to acknowledging, the sort of disparity when it comes to reproductive rights and so on. But I think that a lot of the reason why it's hard to be nuanced is that, the radical feminist side of things, it's just such an all or nothing position.
And political opportunism also makes strange bedfellows. So recently we saw trans exclusionary radical feminists from the UK who claim to be socialists and sort of, committed radical feminists, as well as, hating in particular trans women, go to the States to meet up with like the hard right evangelical Christian bloc to sort of unite in this, war on the existence of trans people. And I thought that was a very revealing moment for, getting a sense of what their priorities are.
Yeah, well, the thing about the radical feminists at this point is that, like, even if everything they're saying about trans people is correct, like suppose everything they say is true, suppose trans women are men, suppose we're invading women's spaces, suppose all of it, they've still gone completely off the rails because they're spending so much time and so much effort on this little issue that like is costing them so much, and they're just sacrificing all their other values. Like when you're willing to team up with pro-life organizations and so on, like is stopping trans people really that essential? Is it that central to the feminist agenda that everything else comes second? Like, this is not, to me, this is, this is when you've watched hate kind of take over. And it's something that's, it's very frustrating at the moment, but I'm kind of optimistic about what we call TERFism not really taking off, because I think TERFs ultimately can't build allies very effectively, because on the left they're always going to have trouble building allies, because like trans people, this is a fact that trans people are a marginalized group, and other people on the left are going to want to be allies to trans people. So what they have to do instead, as long as they have a strong anti-trans agenda, is they have to build allies with conservatives, with social conservatives, with evangelicals. And then the feminist part just kind of slips away, and then a TERF is just a new form of conservative.
I mean, I think there's sort of two kinds of, trans exclusionary feminism. One is the sort of lazy erasure, which I know that I held particularly when I was at uni, where the experience of trans people just didn't really enter my head, because I was like, oh, like, why would it? And it was only when I became friends with someone who was trans and sort of saw how she had to navigate her daily life in public space, where I was like, holy shit, there is this thing that I've never considered. It's also the sort of thing which, maybe my mum held, because I remember chatting to her ages ago when she was saying, well, trans women are fine, but, aren't they men? Or like, oh, I'm worried about, children having puberty blockers. And then I chatted to her about it a while later, so maybe 2 years after we'd had that conversation, and her mind had completely changed, and her feminism had become so much more trans inclusive. But I don't really know where that had come from. Like, I feel that she just sort of, it's not as if she's on the internet or like, reading the, latest piece in like, Lies, a journal of, materialist feminism. So she sort of absorbed trans inclusivity by osmosis. And I thought that that was a sort of very different thing from, that pathological hatred of, in particular, trans women, that, it keeps you up at night thinking about whether or not, they were in the same dressing room as you one time 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think that that's a very important distinction, because I think that most people don't know that much about trans people. And so your first like intuitions about it are going to be wrong. Like, so most people, you think, what is a trans person? Oh, a person who transitions male to female. Like the first way a person's going to conceptualize that is, oh, like men dressed as women. Like, you know what I mean? Like, because it's not intuitive to understand like how someone who just lives full time in the social role of a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth, like functionally is that gender. And like, that's something that's not, I think, obvious to people until you've really like spent time around trans people, which most people haven't. So that's very understandable. Then you have this other thing, which is, as you say, yeah, this kind of like deep fixation and hatred. And that's, to me, it seems like it's completely taken over the TERF groups, which are just like I said, they said they've gone off the rails. It's an obsession. And so I made this video, this was 2 videos ago, it was called Gender Critical, where like the video is framed as a response to like diehard gender critical feminists, but it's really not, because I know I'm not going to convince them. It's really a performative display of engaging with them for the sake of an audience that's on the fence or that doesn't know that much about it.
I also found like their adoption of the phrase gender critical really interesting. So I was like, you are the least gender critical people I can think of, which is the sort of assigning of, social, cultural norms to do with gender, like onto chromosomes. Like, it's a very strange phrase.
Yeah, right. They want, well, it's very perplexing, because they say they want to abolish gender, they want to get rid of gender, but like they're very insistent that our use of pronouns in the English language must track with chromosomes. They're very insistent that like anyone who's assigned one gender at birth like definitely has to stay within that box. And like it just seems like, it's just a position that sort of dogmatically refuses to consider the reality of trans people's lives.
But also the overlap with, racialized notions of gender and femininity. There's been a huge comeback of, I think, like almost colonial notions of what it means to be a woman. I've experienced a little bit of it from some of the, TERF mob, where they're like, we've clocked her, she's definitely a trans woman, look at that 5 o'clock shadow on her face. And I'm like, look, I'm just Bangladeshi, like we all have that. Like, sorry fam. And then you look at the treatment of Casta Semenya, which is just this completely spurious attempt to police her out of the sports world despite being a cisgender woman.
Yeah, well, what's so fascinating to me is how, TERFs, they start with this position of like, oh, we need to liberate females from gender, from femininity and stuff. But then like a certain conception of femininity ends up gatekeeping womanhood again by their own position, which is why you get like the Drake Castor Semenya stuff. And like you have of course, once you start keeping womanhood and, femininity is always going to be a part of one of the criteria. And then that's going to rebound against gender nonconforming women, against lesbians, against non-white women who are sort of, have to work harder, in other words, to get into what is like a kind of white framed vision of what a woman is.
Yeah, I mean, that's just also not gonna fucking happen. I'm just like, I
Yeah.
season my food and I talk with my hands. Like, the Bengali is not going away anytime soon. But, like, thinking about the historical context that lots of this, what you've identified as counter-revolution comes in, is that particularly with the legal erasure of trans people and the sort of, trans moral panic that seems to be gripping both Britain and America, and in America to try and start finding coercive legislative solutions for it, is that it reminds me of the sort of 19th century homosexual panic, which in Britain culminates with the trial of Oscar Wilde. And then the reason why there's this obsession with imposing very rigid norms when it comes to men and their expressions of sexuality and the sort of need to have this sort of like iron moustache and, be ruthlessly heterosexual is because it fits in with empire building, really. It's like, you're the kind of guy who can, go out to the colonies and show these natives what for. So it happens kind of, at the apex of the imperial project. Whereas now, in lots of ways, Britain and America is having to deal with geopolitical decline, and in America's case, geoeconomic decline vis-a-vis, China. And so that's the bit which doesn't quite make sense to me, which is, what is the ideological purpose of policing gender and sexuality in the same way when the historical conditions are so different?
Well, one theme I've picked up on in some of this stuff is an anxiety about degeneration, which is actually also very old. And it's present in in Nazi thinking, and also in a lot of 18th and 19th century kind of racist pseudoscience or sexual morality, is this concern that the population will be made sick or be made weak or vulnerable if we allow sort of effeminacy among men to propagate, or and so I think that this is maybe sort of an area of connection between the abortion issue and the anti-trans issue, where basically bodies are sort of policed by gender according to this kind of vision of the population as a organism or something that's like the purpose of individual people is to serve this function that's going to men are supposed to work and to protect and all this stuff, and women are supposed to produce children. Well, women who have abortions and trans people are not fitting into this picture very well. And that's one of the motivations, I think, it's explicitly stated when you look at the really far right people, this is basically just how they talk about it. But I think it's kind of there quietly all the time.
I mean, and there's this sort of racial undertone to it too, which is the idea that white people are being bred out of countries in the global north, and so you have these scare stories about there's only one white kid in a school in Leicester and stuff like that, to try and it really imposed that sense of panic. And then it has repercussions for what the role of even white women's sexuality is.
That's exactly how I see this far right the structure of the far right worldview, is that it's based on sort of two threats. There's the external threat of invasion, right? That is, non-white people most of the time that we're talking about, who are understood as threatening the integrity of the people, the white people. But they try to avoid saying it so explicitly, but that's the sort of the thought. And as you say, yeah, these pictures of schools where it's oh my God, look at this school where 60% of the children aren't white, and this is supposed to cause a panic, and then the sort of corresponding threat is this threat from within, the decay, the degeneracy that's supposed to be resulting from things like queerness, homosexuality, trans people, abortion, extramarital sex. Any of this kind of stuff is viewed as kind of this like internal sickness that's weakening the race. Again, fascists will just say that, but in other types of far-right people, they'll kind of imply it.
Code it. Cultural anxieties.
Cultural anxieties, yeah.
Racial self-interest, which isn't the same thing as racism, according to Eric Kaufman. That's my favorite one. I was just like, that's a lot of syllables to just say racist, man.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing the number of new words that we're going to hear that just mean racism, but not that.
There's racially charged, like, lithium batteries, like something is racially charged. I mean, thinking, this is kind of off topic, but I've got like a pet theory about sort of 19th century theories of sickness in society, is that there's this sort of idea of the body politic, the project of empire, blah, 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 blah. But also everything is actually about syphilis. So like my hot take is that Picture of Dorian Gray, actually about syphilis.
Okay.
So Dorian's portrait, aging in the attic, he's going mad, the sort of threat of contagion, him corrupting other people. That's syphilis. It's definitely syphilis. There's a prose poem by Baudelaire called Miss Scalpel. So I think that's the translation of Madame Bistoury. And so she's this kind of like, slightly off-kilter sex worker who goes to a doctor, and then it's the sort of reversal of the normal sex worker and client relationship, because she's like treating him as a sex worker and pays him in a way that makes him feel really weird. And I was just like, syphilis, it's about syphilis.
I think there's something to that. Like, I definitely think that a lot of forms of bigotry sort of have some psychological root in what is like a perversion of a kind of hygienic anxiety. Like, well, I mean, there's a reason why, again, like the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, like why this was such the center of homophobic propaganda, because there's this kind of, there already exists this kind of natural anxiety about sort of, who you have sex with. It's kind of, is this very commonly taboo thing in every culture, because, it involves this, crossing of boundaries between bodies that I think humans are sort of naturally disposed to form anxieties about, because of like hygienic reasons, right? Like it's good for us to not, to be sort of squeamish about certain things. But I think of course all that has cultural conditioning as well. And so I think that, any way that you can associate the target of your bigotry with uncleanliness, right? Genocide is usually preceded by talk about vermin. And again, it's a language of a plague.
I mean, the sort of interesting parallel with the AIDS crisis, which is sort of remembered, and rightly so, as a form of homophobic gay panic, is that it also overlapped with border regimes in a very big way. So you had the restrictions on travel from places like Haiti or Zimbabwe or South Africa, and the way in which there was this sort of idea of, the virus spreading through like the presence of like quite literally a foreign body in the global north was, I mean, I kind of feel that's a little underexplored bit of that history.
Oh, I definitely think that's true. Yeah.
So, I mean, before we wrap up, I always am wary of sort of ending on like a big old bum note, which was like, oh yeah, the AIDS crisis, that was really sad, is thinking about spaces and reasons for optimism. Because, Hannah Arendt, when she's talking about how far-right movements work, one of the things that she says that they do is that they alleviate loneliness. And there's a very, human and natural need to alleviate loneliness. So on the left, where do you see cause for hope and optimism? And where do you see the alleviation of loneliness?
Well, I see a lot of cause for optimism, actually. I mean, as I said at the beginning of this interview, I think that like the intellectual dark web has lost its cool factor. And what I see having like the internet has absolutely changed in the last 3 years since I started doing this. YouTube has completely changed. There's like a whole new this community of like leftist creators, and there's all these Discord servers and all these Facebook groups and all these, there's this whole Twitter world. Like it's much, it's I mean hundreds of times bigger than it was 3 years ago when I started. So there's a real alternative that seems to have gained a lot of momentum. That seems like a cause for optimism. I think that there's sort of this building, like, cultural sort of sympathy that seems to be growing with the, anti-Trump and maybe back in 2015 everyone was kind of ready for a backlash because there were all these Jezebel articles about, is it racist to call Miley, or is it sexist to call Miley Cyrus racist, or like people were kind of like, people we're sick of the activists because we were annoying. But now I think it's the rise of Trump and what he's done has kind of made it clear that, oops, like the activists were actually right the whole time. And it's too bad it took this to make anyone listen. But I do think it's having an effect. And I do think that, when I look at the generation of people who are undergraduates right now, they are much more sympathetic to, I think, any kinds of progressive activism than they were when I was there, 8 or 10 years ago.
I mean, I look at Generation Z in particular and I'm just like, oh my God, like the future's going to be fine if it's in your hands. Like you guys are sick. Also, you've managed to work out how Snapchat works, which to me is like completely baffling. Thank you so much for taking the time joining us. I have really enjoyed this conversation.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Cool. Yeah, I'm excited for the most ambitious crossover event in left social media history. Well, maybe it's not that ambitious. It's not really like, Varoufakis like joining Nigella Lawson doing a cooking show or something, but it's not far off either.
We stand.
Nigella and Big Yanni. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
Well, hi there. I'm sorry, that was cringy. If you enjoyed this interview, please like it on YouTube, please share it to your friends, your lovers, your family, and your enemies, and subscribe to us as well. Follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. And if you really liked us, like cash money liked us, go to support.novaramedia.com to give away some of your hard-earned cash, either as a one-off donation or as a rolling monthly subscription. And let me know who else you would like to see me or anyone else in the Novara family interview. Bonus points if they're Anthony Joshua. I would like that very much.